But as I started to fall, time stopped and my body was frozen in midair. I received a telepathic message. The time shift was that I received 9 years of events in an instant.
Kia ora, hello, and welcome back. This is the Let's Talk Near Death podcast. Today I'm chatting with my guest, Lori Lynne Johnson. She's a registered nurse, a respiratory therapist, and she has over 2 decades of work in critical care. She's been doing research, she's been helping people at end of life, supporting families and individuals who are dying. She also had her very interesting near-death experience at age 9. And today she helps people raise their energetic frequency for healing and awakening. So many good things in this, and I'm looking forward to it. Lori Lynne, first of all, welcome along to Let's Talk Near Death.
Thank you, Kirsty. Great to be here.
I'm excited to chat to you, not only because of all the amazing work that you've been doing, but you had a near-death experience as a child, which I find fascinating. I can relate to some of this. Are you happy to take us back to when you were 9 years old?
Absolutely. So it was not a typical near-death experience. It was, for a long time, I didn't identify it as a near-death experience because of that. And it wasn't until later in life I realized that that's exactly what it was. But I was about 9 years old and in grade school. And at that time, they would, a couple times a year, take us for trips to conservation areas. And sometimes they would give us compasses and maps and have us try and find our way around, or we would collect leaves and take them back to school and identify them, that sort of thing. And I'm in a small group of classmates. We're walking along, and somehow I got too close to an edge and fell off. Hard at that age to tell how high it was, but my recollection is it was no more than 10 feet. It was significant, but it was not a humongous height. But as I started to fall, time stopped and my body was frozen in midair. I did not see any light or any beings or anything like that, but I received a telepathic message that if I continued to fall the way I was, that I was going to strike my head on a rock and that I would die. While I was receiving this message, this didn't concern me in any way. But I was also told that if I wanted to, I could choose to continue on and not die. The other thing that happened at that time was I saw all of my life up till that point in an instant. And after the event was over, that was actually what stayed with me, not the being frozen in midair or the messages. I was really thrown by the fact that the time shift was that I received 9 years of events in an instant. So and again, it was not a review like we sometimes hear with near-death experiences. I did not experience the events from anybody else's perspective. This was strictly for my perspective as a review of everything that had happened in this lifetime up until then. I made the choice to continue on in this life. And once I had made that choice, my body was turned in midair, reshifted. And when time resumed, I continued to fall. But instead of hitting my head on the rock, I hit my knee on the rock. And I was mildly injured. I remember, classmates sort of having to help me out of this conservation area that I was limping. I recall, having to go to the hospital, have x-rays of my knee. I was on crutches for a brief period of time afterwards. And I was telling people what had occurred, but nobody ever acknowledged hearing me tell that part of the story.
Wow.
And after a couple of days, I just sort of thought, well, I guess there's no point in me talking about this anymore. It was never, though, that anybody said, that's crazy, or stop saying that, you're lying, or there was never any reaction of any kind. And I've reached the point now where I actually feel like they truly didn't hear it, that they weren't supposed to hear it. And because of how I felt after the event, it did not give me the sort of existential change that we hear very often when people have near-death experiences. It was not something where I became very spiritual. I was not having connections to spirit and having any of the clairs or anything like that. It became this event in my life that was obviously very unusual, very momentous, but it just sort of stayed in its little sort of package as this one little thing that nobody ever engaged with me about. It was just sort of for me, this experience. And when I sort of, had more of this typical spiritual awakening in 2017 was when I realized, oh, this event is to show you that there are very unusual spiritual, energetic events that happen. And it helped to sort of ground me as I was going through that experience. The one thing it did leave me with was a lifetime curiosity about near-death experiences. And that didn't sort of happen until I was nearing adulthood, only because it wasn't ever named or talked about. I would have had this around 1977. And, it wasn't until the 80s when people even started to discuss near-death experiences, from a on the fringe sort of thing. I had always been drawn to medicine and wanted to work in medicine. I thought about being a paramedic when I was very young. Then for a while, I thought I would be a doctor. But by the time I was reaching the end of high school and it's time to choose your career, nursing was the one that just felt like it sat right inside of me. And I knew that it would give me the greatest ability to provide sort of hands-on care for people and to sort of be a little closer to patients than you would as a physician or a paramedic. So that's what I was drawn to. And so certainly I think that the experience guided me through my medical career, by sort of giving me that interest in near-death experiences, palliative care. I was always interested and not intimidated by when patients die. So I think it also left me just with that sort of underlying knowledge, not always at the front of my mind, but probably subconsciously, that death is not something to fear, that death is something that we have more control of than we may think we do. And sort of was a more subtle impact on my life up until, about 5 or 6 years ago.
Wow. There's so much in it. I'm just so many questions and I love it. Thank you so much, Lori, for sharing that. There's part of it which I'm resonating with because you were 9 years old. I had my own near-death experience when I was 12 years old. So I think it's a really interesting time of life, an interesting stage, because you're still finding out about the world. You're still coming to a point where you have your own views on things. And I wouldn't say, actually, maybe you disagree. I wouldn't say we have a huge lifetime of experience already.
No.
And yet you're there. And in this, I'm taking it as like a split moment. You get to choose, do I live or do I die? Do I continue or do I not? How much were you aware of what would happen if you chose to not continue? So then you would stay, your head would hit the rock, and that would be it.
There was the experience of not being 9-year-old Lori Lynne.
Yeah.
That the perspective that I I received the messages and made the decision from, now I would equate it as my higher self, my soul, my spirit. And there was just, because of that, there was an absolute calmness about the decision. I did not experience any fear. I did not experience any thought about my family. Now,
Okay.
I'm
Yep.
9 years old. I don't think it is the perspective of, people who have, near-death experiences in adulthood that have children and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. But there was never a thought of, oh, gee, I'll miss my parents and my brother and sister. And there was no consideration of that whatsoever. It was a purely, singular thought of where I was making that decision from. And it did not feel emotional in any way whatsoever.
Okay. That's quite different to what I thought you were going to say. I thought you were going to feel the emotion, have more clarity around what would happen, whichever option you took. I was also thinking about your classmates who are potentially up on the hill, and we talk a lot within these conversations around the topic of we're in soul groups and we all agree things before we come here, things that are going to play out. And just thinking, was this something that they had any influence in? Did you take into account what they would see had you hit your head and then died? Because that's quite traumatic for classmates at 9 years old. There's a lot. I don't know.
Yeah,
I think
no.
I'm overthinking it, to be honest, Lori Lynne.
Well, but I should share that I think will also help the perspective is, again, I've reflected back on things, since 2017. I took a look back on how my life was lived. And what I realized was that, it's hard at 9 years old to remember sort of my personality and such before that time. So it's hard to know
Mm.
if it changed at that event at 9 or not. But I can tell you that from the time I reflect back to, being in school, when you start high school, perhaps when you start to have that, feel like your personality is really developing. I was not attached to um, people in particular. Um, I was even I was not significantly attached to my family, and I chalked that up to that I was adopted as a baby, and that my parents and my brother and sister were all biologically related. And I had a very different personality from the four of them, but I just would say, oh, well, that's because we don't share DNA. And it was not anything that I was ever concerned about. But I look back now on how I was in high school, and I liked to float into different groups of friends. And, I was on the swim team, so I could sort of hang out with the sports people.
Mm.
I like to sing and do acting, so I could hang out with the musical people. I was intelligent enough that I could sort of hang with the smart people. Um, I would sort of just go in and out, and I could get along with any of those groups and just sort of feel comfortable in them. But I was never attached to a particular friend. It was sort of like being friends with everybody, but not having that, this is my best friend sort of thing. And it wasn't until the last year of high school, which, even though it wasn't a big high school, and 5 years in, I had never shared a class with this one guy who I met in grade 13. And we just had an instant connection, friendship. We started out as friends, but by the end of grade 13, we started dating, and we've been married for 30 years now.
Oh, I love it.
Something that I recognize now in reflecting back is that I've lived my life in a very sort of neutral space where I don't have massive excitement and that sort of stuff. But I also don't experience anxiety. I've never felt depressed, that sort of thing, which has been very helpful working in critical care. I can sort of calm a room down. And I think it was also very beneficial in end of life care, in that when I sort of am in a hospital room or in a house, with somebody passing at home, that the energy that I can provide just sort of gives a sense of calm, and also a sense of, you're in good hands. I am comfortable with this. I can help you through this, that sort of stuff. And I, in reflecting back, I see now that was an unusual way of me sort of living emotionally, that was just very balanced and very neutral.
You've definitely got a presence about you, and I can feel it in your voice even. Just that grounded presence, which is exactly aligned with where you need to be in that kind of work. So, do you think that came out of your experience when you're 9, the ability to be like this? Like, is that
It's
what
hard
set
to
you up for
know.
this work?
I'm starting to feel like it did. I'm starting to feel, in reflecting back on that event, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Paul Selig.
Mm, mm.
He's a clairaudient channeler who's channeled about a dozen books. And I can't even remember how I heard about his one book, but I listened to it on audiobook in the car one time. And there was early on an attunement that he channeled through with these guides. And I had to pull my car over because my whole body started to vibrate.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, okay, there's something, I am connected somehow, to this. And so I went through the books, and eventually I bought a private reading with him, which is hard to get. And he was able to say with that event when I was 9, he said, there's more to it than you can remember. There were things that occurred that you have not remembered and won't remember. And he has said that once I leave this life, I will know more about the importance of that near-death experience.
I think this is a thing for all of us. I think we have very little understanding of all of the pieces of life, the puzzle of life, all the little pieces that are taking place.
Yeah.
I don't know that we'll understand the full extent of everything until we've left this life, which is a little bit of a tease in some ways, but I think we can't grasp it. We can't understand the significance of some things and not the others, and the way it all intertwines. So,
I
yeah,
think
it's
it's
really
a
fascinating.
combination of can't understand in this three-dimensional
Yeah,
reality, and a little bit of we're probably not supposed to.
yeah, because we might not have the same life if we understand more than yeah, it's a bit too much for our little human brains, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that it's a little bit, it's kind of like if you know how the magician does the trick,
Yeah, it's not the
it's going
same.
to totally spoil your experience of watching the magic show. That's the way.
Yeah, I love that analogy. That works beautifully, beautifully. Now, I'd love to chat, Lori Lynne, around your work that you've done. So you're a registered nurse. You've been working with people at end of life for some time, helping people through the transition. Can you share a little bit about what that's been like? Are there any particular themes that stand out? Any stories? What are
There's
you happy to
always
share?
stories. I think anybody that's done end of life care for any period of time has many stories. And I've experienced obviously people, transitioning in hospital, but also I had a home care company for 8 years, and we did a lot of palliative care for people that wanted to pass in their homes. But one of the first experiences I had was my father-in-law. He passed, unfortunately, at age 60, barely 60 years
Oh,
old.
it's young.
And that was 1996. And we didn't do that in people's homes very much back then. It was pretty new, but he had always had a horrible fear of hospitals and begged us to, not have him die in a hospital. But there were no hospices at that time. It was not a thing. And so we managed to sort of pull it together. It was very chaotic, and he passed very quickly. He literally went to work on a Monday and he passed that Sunday night. His deterioration was very rapid, which again I look back on and realize that he was directing that. He was choosing that. But we got to that Sunday evening. It was obvious that he was going to pass. The VON had come in. We finally got some pain medicine going for him, but he was, it was difficult to watch that death. We did not get him comfortable, peaceful, which I think also was very impactful for me for moving forward. It's always a big focus for me to have patients have not only dignified deaths, but comfortable deaths as well. But the story with him was, at some point, after sort of struggling with this discomfort and not being conscious, he opened his eyes and he looked up to the right corner of the room. And it was at that time just me and my mother-in-law in the room. And he just got this beautiful look on his face of peace, and he smiled. And I said to him, what do you see? And he said, Rose. And I said to my mother-in-law, who's Rose? And she said, oh, that's his mother. And I knew enough at that point instinctively just to say to him, oh, John, she's here for you. She's here. You can go with her. She's come for you. And just, I won't ever forget that first time seeing a face change so dramatically of a patient that's at end of life. And then as I continued on, all these sort of stories strengthened my belief that we have control over our death far more than we believe. I've seen it many times in hospital where families are having bedside vigils, sometimes for 24, 36 hours or more. And they finally exhaust themselves and say, okay, we're just going to go to the cafeteria for 20 minutes, have a bite to eat, a coffee, that sort of thing. And that's when the patient passes.
Yeah.
And then they return and they're so upset. And so I now make it part of my practice. If the patient appears to be hanging on and we can't sort of figure out any reason why, I will say to family members now, sometimes people don't want somebody watching them when they pass. And I had the mother of a friend who actually told me that prior to her death. She said, I don't want anybody around me. And so I was the one that sat with her. And when I could tell it was coming to the end, I just sort of whispered in her ear, I'm going to go down the hall to the den. I said, I'm going to come back in about 20 minutes. I said, so if this is the time you want to go. And I came back in 20 minutes and she was very close to death. Respirations were very, very irregular and shallow. And I said, okay, I'm going to go back down the hall for 10 more minutes and then I'm going to come back. And then she had passed. So I now make it a point to tell people, and if I see family members going off for that coffee, I'll say to them, if something happens while you're gone, don't feel upset or guilty. This may be exactly what they're waiting for. But I've seen the opposite, where people hang on for time that we can't imagine. There was a gentleman I'll never forget in his 90s who we had started caring for in a retirement home setting on a Friday. And by the Monday, he had to go to hospital. His daughter had left that weekend for a 3-week European vacation. So he was in hospital. His wife decided that she didn't want anything but comfort measures, and the daughter decided that she was going to continue on her vacation. However, no judgment, however that you look at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And 2 weeks goes by, and we're still providing care in the hospital, augmenting. And every day we would go in and I would talk with the hospital staff, and none of us could believe that this gentleman was still alive with no fluids. And so his daughter came back. It wasn't the full 3 weeks, but she came back. I remember it was Thanksgiving weekend, which we celebrate on a Monday. And so she came in on that Thanksgiving Monday. She sat down at his bedside. She held his hand. She said whatever she said. And before she got to her car in the parking lot, that man had passed.
Oh my goodness, so soon.
And he was waiting for her to come home and to have his moment with her. And from a physical standpoint, I can tell you that I do not know how that happened. That sort of goes beyond traditional thinking of what the body does and how it works with medicine. And I remember another woman who, I mean, her breathing was so shallow and slow, but there was one, a family, all the family were in the room, but there was one son left who was traveling from about an hour and a half away from where we were. And I don't know how she held on, but he came into the room, he picked up her hand, he said, "Mom, I'm here." And within 20 seconds, she didn't take another breath.
Oh my goodness.
And I've seen it too, where
Yeah.
patients live, for significant events. They'll live much longer than expected to have a grandchild be born, to have a birthday pass, for an anniversary. I've seen it for doing home care. I've seen many patients that pass in January and February because they hold on through the holidays for their family and such. And so over the years, all of that accumulating experience again, and plus my own experience, at age 9, just gives me a lot of comfort about the process of our death, and that we have more control over it than we probably think we do as just going through our regular life.
Yeah, it still blows my mind. I have heard countless stories very, very similar to what you've said. 3 weeks was quite a long time. I don't think I've heard one that long. I
That
was
was
chatting
very
with,
unusual.
yeah, that it really is. I was chatting with a hospice nurse one time, and she said that the hospice she was in, it was really, it wasn't uncommon for people. She said one of the busiest days of the year to die was on Boxing Day. So people would hold on. It'll be the early hours in the morning of Boxing Day, almost like they don't want to disrupt the Christmas Day, or don't want to have that connection of the anniversaries following as Christmas Day.
Yep, exactly.
When I heard this, I thought, oh my goodness, yeah, you're not the first person to tell me how much you think we have control in our own death. Makes me think about at what point, because I don't believe death is a one moment to the next. I believe we go through a transition, and it's almost like a veil, and we come in and out of this life and to wherever we go, or whatever that's like. I wonder at what point we can control, or are they aware, or is this happening at a subconscious level when they're right at the end of their life and can choose, well, I'm going to hold on till Thursday instead of Tuesday. I don't know. Gets my brain going. So
I
many
do. I
questions.
know. And that's just it. I'm at the point where I'm so confident that we have that ability, but I have no idea how that ability manifests and exists. And again, I think that's more just, not knowing how the magic trick happens. That it's a little bit of a mystery. But I agree with you. It's a transition effect, and I've sort of felt intuitively in the past few years. I'm sort of claircognizant, where instead of sort of, hearing messages, it's sort of just thoughts and intuitive things that I experience. And one of them a long time ago I had was, and it goes with, I was always very curious about why we say that we only use 10% of our brain. Knowing about how all the other organs in our body works, they all work at peak efficiency. They're never resting. They're never, yes, the liver can regenerate, but the liver is always functioning at peak efficiency. And it never made sense to me that the most important and complex organ in our body, we don't use most of it. But the intuition I received was that, could the brain be, many people talk about a filter of the brain, but if our natural state was, energy, spirit, whatever you want to describe that as, but at a much higher frequency, obviously, and that in order to have the experience of physicalness, three-dimensional ness, obviously, a much denser and slower vibration and frequency. What if 90% of the brain is, in a sense, compressing that frequency down, 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 down to where it looks like it's functioning with 10%, because the other 90% is, in a sense, holding back that sort of natural spiritual state in order for us to have a physical experience. And then I started thinking about some things that made sense if we think about the fact that we need sleep more than anything else besides oxygen to exist. That we can go longer without fluids, food, shelter, anything, but our body must sleep. And again, the intuition was that is when the brain can go back to its releasing that compression and return to its sort of more spiritual, natural state, which is, of course, when we dream and when we have that sort of new connection. And then it's almost like the brain gets to return to itself before compressing back down when we come into our awake state. And that when we go without sleep, we tend to go into like a psychosis, or we hear voices, or we see things. And again, it gave me that sense of like the brain is sort of breaking through that other side. And the brain is sort of saying, if you don't sleep in a minute, this whole thing is going to go and you're going to see everything behind the curtain. and you don't want that. Go to sleep and I'll release the curtain and everything will be fine in 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. And then you can wake back up and everything is sort of reset again. And so I've always sort of thought to myself, that explains a few different things. It sort of fits some things that we also know, that the brain becomes more active when we sleep. As opposed to what our instinct would be, which is that, the body sort of, goes to sleep and shuts down, but instead our brain becomes more active. So that perspective also helps me sort of feel like when people are transitioning, that veil, the brain and the consciousness, that can explain some parts of near-death experiences as well, in that 10%, perhaps goes to 40%, and you get connected to this sort of more natural spiritual state. And so those are some things to think about.
I have to say, I've never heard a theory like it.
I know. I keep waiting to hear. I keep waiting to hear somebody say it, because I think, Am I the only one that's ever had this thought? I hear lots of talk about the brain being a filter for consciousness,
Yeah.
but nobody has ever sort of given a good explanation of why it appears that we only use 10% of our brain.
So yeah, I love the idea. If I've understood it correctly, Lori Lynne, the idea that we use the 10%, but then the 90% is around frequency, and it's almost like compressing it, defragging it, and tidying it all up into nice little
Lowering it, in
compartments.
a sense, lowering that frequency
Yeah,
down to the one that we use to have a physical, three-dimensional experience.
yeah.
But it
But
is not
that's
our natural state, and we can only hold it in this state for a certain period of time, certain number of hours as we look at time, and then we have to kind of release it
mm,
and have our dream time and have it, because that is our natural state, as opposed to that, we're like this at one point. I look at it as a continuum, that all of those states are us, and that this sort of slower vibrational state is the one that we just need to sort of compress it down to in order to have this experience.
yeah. Yeah, it does make a bit of sense to me. I need to think on it a little further before I commit.
I know.
But you wouldn't be able to pick this up, when they're doing brain scans and activity things, when you stick all the things on your head, that would not pick up all the frequency work or the capacity that the other 90% does. If you're listening and you have a theory on this, please leave a comment. Let us know.
Yes.
I don't know.
Well,
There'll be
and
some people out there who understand this more than us, maybe.
I am not an expert with the brain. I will say
Oh, me
that.
neither.
Um,
Me neither.
and but the thought I had with regards to, you're absolutely right with the measurement part. I thought about the fact that how many hundreds of years ago, and probably not that many hundreds of years ago, we couldn't understand how the heart worked electrically.
Mm,
We could not measure, our EKG, measurements and our waveforms, and know exactly what part of the heart was occurring and pumping and relaxing at those various points. We do now.
mm.
We have lots of knowledge about that. It doesn't mean that 100 years ago our heart was not pumping in our chest in
Yeah.
exactly that same way. We
Uh-huh.
just had no measurement to tell us it, and couldn't know that knowledge. And so I feel like that you're exactly right. That is part of what is happening with our brain. We just aren't able to measure it or know it at this point.
Yeah, I think about this sometimes and I get quite excited by how much medical technology is advancing. And so the
Very
effect that
much.
has on how many near-death experiences happen, what end of life can look like, but also just what are they going to be able to measure soon that we aren't even aware of now?
That's one of the exciting things about AI. I know our natural inclination is to worry about the things that might go wrong with AI, but in the field of medicine, AI is very exciting
Yeah.
in what it will be able to open up for us that we haven't before. And those are sort of the things that I think will come soon.
Yeah. I really like it. I'm thinking around mood swings, and when we're tired, we get grumpy and we can't focus so much, we get brain fog. All of that aligns with that. I need to think on it more. So leave it
I
with me, Lori
know
Lynne.
there are parts of it that made sense to me as I thought of it, that kind of, again, makes me brave enough to talk about it on a podcast, because I'm still, every podcast I listen to, I keep waiting to hear, is somebody going to say something like this? And I still haven't heard it yet, but I'm sure I am not the only one that's ever had that thought. Yes.
Oh, I really like it because let's open a space and see what comes out. Yeah. I'm curious to get your perspective. You've had your experience at 9. You've been with a lot of people at end of life. You've worked, done the palliative care, the hospice style work. Why do you think we live and die? What is our purpose for being here? And why do we need to leave?
I feel that our purpose is to have experiences. So, and that all experiences are valuable. This is something that, I sort of came to in the past 10 years, is the idea that if we could design our life, we say as humans, I would never have any worry, I would never have any need, I would never, want for anything. So I would never pick this life. I would never pick to have pain and hardships and struggle and such. And I think, we can all understand why somebody would feel that way. But I feel like, and I use a lot of analogies with movies because I love going to the movies and I
Cool.
always have. And I look to it as, if that was really true, we would never make movies of people having struggles and hardships. We actually admire those things. We live as humans feeling like, for a lot of time, that anything that's too easy is not worth doing, or doesn't have as much value or worth. That if you could go to school for 4 years for your degree, or you could take it in 3 months and learn everything, that we would not give it as much value. So I feel like experiences, all of them, have value. The ones where we feel like life is really, really smooth and good, but also those times when life is challenging us and testing us and making us uncomfortable. And it does, when we get through it and we look back, we see the difference we've gained in the person you were before the struggle and the person you are afterwards. I also think there's value sometimes in having a struggle that you're actually demonstrating it for somebody else and you don't even know it sometimes. That sometimes we think we come through this life and it's only for our own growth and experience. Sometimes you're doing it for someone else. We talk about soul families. Sometimes, yes, I'm going to come in for my soul family and I'm going to go through something difficult, but I'm going to do it for the benefit of somebody else in my soul family. So sometimes it's good to just not always have the perspective of, but why would I choose this for myself? Well, maybe you didn't choose it for yourself. So I feel like the ultimate purpose of life is just to have experiences, and as many as possible, and as wide variety of experiences as possible, and from different perspectives. Why it ends, I believe, is because, again, it gives it importance if it ends. If it never ended, we would not value it.
Yeah, I think
And
you're
so
right.
I've thought of this, and the analogy that I sometimes think of is when we go on vacation. So and I do this, I assume other people do this too, I'm not crazy, but when I go on vacation and I've got my 7 days, or my 6 days, 7 nights, I know that when I hit day 1 and I go to the beach, I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is fantastic. I've got, 5 more days of this. This is fantastic. And then I get to about day 3 and I think, oh gosh, okay, this is the best because I'm really relaxed. I've had my 2 good days. I viewed like day 3 and 4 is my best days of vacation, because I've had a couple days to relax. I've let go all the stress of life. I'm in my vacation. I take beach vacations, and I still have all those days left. I still got days 5 and 6 in the bank, kind of thing, sitting there. Then day 5 comes and you're kind of like, ooh, this is like next to last day sort of thing. And then day 6 comes and you're like, oh boy, okay, like today is the day, tomorrow I'm going home. You shape your vacation in that sense of what I'm going to do on those different days based on how much time I have left in the vacation. if you never came home from the vacation, you would tend to, I think, take those days for granted. And unfortunately, I think it's something that the general public has done itself a disservice by not coming to terms with the idea that this life ends. We tend to, in a general sense, convince ourselves that death is not going to happen. And because of that, we tend to look at life as being never ending, will last forever, which means you don't value the days a little less. And I think it's often why I obviously see a lot of people be confronted with death or the nearing of death in a very sort of sudden manner. And everybody is always shocked that, oh no, death is coming now. It should be the least shocking thing we ever experience. It's the one consistent, 100% constant, yet it's the one thing that shocks us almost more than anything else. Like when you get told somebody you know has died, it shouldn't be shocking. It will happen for all of us at some point. But because we have sort of convinced ourselves in our mind, oh, if I don't think about dying, if I don't think about death, then I don't have to ever sort of envision it or discuss it or anything like that. It cheats us in a little bit of, I think, the full value of our time in this life. And it's why I think that some people, fear death greatly, and why I think that people reach an appropriate end of their life based on their age, based on their physical condition, and yet they want to hold on, and they'll take medical procedures that don't really give them quality of life anymore, but it prevents them from dying. It gives them just more time in a body that has failed, but we can stop them from actually dying. And a lot of people choose that because they are so afraid. And I feel like if we, as a society, developed a healthier approach and understanding of death, that you come into this life, but it will end at some point, that you would live in a way that when the time came that your life was ending, that you would look back on your time and go, well, you know what? I really made the most of that. I don't have any regrets. I lived a good life. I enjoyed my life. I made changes for people in my life. Whatever people hold, which is an individual sense of what the value of your life has been, and what you want a good life to define for you. That I think people would reach the end of their life with that intact, as opposed to, oh no, I convinced myself this was never coming and now it's here, and I want more time. I need to do things. I need to.
Yeah. Oh, this gets me when people aren't ready. They've left things undone or unsaid, or, that really actually gets me, in the heart. It's tough to hear people who are at such a state in terms of there's not something they can do about it, to be having these regrets.
And I feel though that podcasts like this and discussion of frank discussions of death in near-death experiences as part of that, but just the frank discussion of death, making it not so scary, making it feel more comfortable for people. And it's happening generationally. I think that each generation, because each generation is seeing death more than the one before it, and is also making different choices about their own death because of that, and being given from laws of countries and such around dying, being given a little more control sometimes over the timing of and purpose of their death. So each generation, I think, is starting to become a little more comfortable with
Yeah.
the end of life. And I think that that also gives each generation a little better life in general, all things considered.
I think you're right with that. I think we're talking about it more. It's something I'd really love to see talked about from a very young age. We also hear we've had big discussions. I've had big discussions with people around, do you take children to funerals? But what if death education was taught in primary school, or not like a subject, but just the awareness, making it known, making it more everyday and more familiar, because it seems so scary and so out there compared to now. Yeah, it's fascinating. I love to ask you this question because we talk a lot on the podcast about why do you think we're here, why we're alive, but actually to hear why you think we might die is fascinating. It's a fine line, I think, between being aware of it at a younger age or earlier on in life versus leaving it to the last minute. But also, I think if we get too involved and weighed down by it too early in life, that can also make us a little bit afraid of it or not fully live. So I think there's
I
possibly
agree.
balance in everything. Yeah.
I do. I think that that discussing it frankly with children is the healthier approach. And I think that's becoming more understood.
Yeah.
Our generation, our parents somehow felt like you had to keep it, you didn't talk about it with the kids. And that just automatically makes the children more fearful of it
Mm,
because it's
mm.
something sort of secretive and something's going on if somebody's dying or has died in your family. But if the adults are sort of whispering about it and the minute you come into the room they stop talking, and children are smart enough to be able to pick up on this idea of, oh, this thing that's happened, it's very scary, it's very um, it's something not to be discussed, and it just gives it that framework that the kids sort of carry with them as they grow up
Mm.
and then have their own approach to it, but your baseline has not been the healthiest to start with.
Mm, I just think it's important that we talk about these discussions right across the board where we can. One final question for you, Lori Lynne. How do you feel about your own death whenever that comes, however far away that is?
I've been listening to your podcast for a long time, so I hear a
You knew
lot
that
of
was coming?
answers. Yes. And I don't hear my answer very often, which is I almost can't wait
Yeah.
for my
Okay.
death. Yeah, I'm perfectly fine to live as long as my soul is choosing to have this lifetime experience. But I am excited about
Mm,
my transition, my death, my passing. I have no fear about, because I know sometimes the standard answer is I'm not afraid to die, I'm afraid of dying.
yeah, the process of
Uh, you know,
dying.
yes,
Yep.
I've watched a lot of people die. I do not feel that we are suffering in our ends of our process of dying. Not the sickness that can precede it, but I feel like when that patient has, sort of lost consciousness, that they're already beginning to transition, you know,
Mm,
to whatever is next. And so I also don't fear that process of dying either. I feel like it's not going to be uncomfortable. And we've heard lots of near-death experiencers talk about that at that moment of a traumatic death, that they are removed from their body ahead of time. They don't
yeah.
experience the drowning. They don't experience the bus hitting them. They, that is not something that is part of the process. And I believe those cases and stories, and so I don't fear that either. I've only had one dream in my life where I was dying. And it
Wow,
was,
that's pretty good.
yeah, for the longest time, I thought I would never have one. It was probably around like 2018, 2019. And I was in a building, sort of racing through a building, and I knew there was a bomb in the building that was going to go off. And I had to find the bomb, before it went off. And there was a very short period of time in the dream where I was racing around trying to find it. I was alone in the building. And then there was a moment where I realized, oh, I'm not going to find the bomb in time. The bomb's going to go off. And I received this feeling of just excitement and just, oh, great. It's here. It's time. It's going to happen. And when I woke up, I realized, oh, okay, I guess the fear of death is really gone now. It showed it to me, in a sense. And so I feel very grateful that I don't look back on regret on any of my life. I'm excited for whatever lies ahead of it, but I'm also eager to see what comes next when this is done as well.
I share that. I get a little bit excited. I'm not done here, but a little bit
This
excited.
is
But
all fine still.
I am one of those people that's like, oh, I am a little nervous about the process of dying. So we'll just see what happens. But from what I know from all of the interviews I've done, the research I've done, the books I've read, everything, I've dedicated quite a bit of time to this topic. So from what I have heard and my firsthand experiences, I think it's something that we don't need to fear. So I hope this puts that out there and people can feel a little bit less overwhelmed by it if they are. Lori
Yeah.
Lynne, I feel like we've touched the tip of the iceberg of this amazing topic. You've got a whole lifetime of stories and work experience and things that you've done. Like I say, there's a lot of research and things that we can add into the conversation. So I feel like we haven't given the conversation full justice, but maybe we'll chat again some other time. I just am so grateful to have you here and thank you for everything you've shared with us.
Thank you so much. I'd be happy to come back and talk to you anytime.
I feel like we could talk. We actually had to remember to click record, didn't we? Because we were
I know.
chatting away, and I was like, "Hang on, we haven't even started yet." So we could talk for 23 hours nonstop at least.
Probably.
Yeah. So Lori Lynne, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Thanks so much. It was a pleasure.